Welcome back everyone. In the last video we saw how we could add different objects in our scene in Blender. In this video we'll be moving, scaling, rotating those objects precisely in Blender. If you remember, in the last course we had learned how to move, scale and rotate objects in Blender. But what if we want a very precisely moved scaled object or rotated object in Blender? Say we want the cube to be precisely 4 by 4 by 4 meters, move 3 meters on the y-axis, 2 meters on the x-axis, 1 meter on the z-axis and rotated 45 degrees on the y-axis and 22 degrees on the x-axis. That's a lot. But we can do it very easily with Blender. First of all, let's start out by clearing what are axes. So axes are the lines that go through a scene. Blender, like most other softwares, has 3 of them. The z-axis, which is always a blue line, which goes from top to bottom. The y-axis, which is a green line that goes from front to back of your scene, and the x-axis is the red line which goes through the sides of your scene. So when you rotate an object, rather than rotating it along that axis like you'd expect, like if I say x, then it would probably try to rotate it like this way. But that's wrong. Actually, it acts like the axis is an imaginary hinge through your object. So it will rotate it along the axis as if it's a hinge rather than opposite to it. So on the x-axis, rotation will actually be like this. Like this for the y-axis. And like that for the z-axis, which goes right through here, but it doesn't show by default in Blender in the 3D view. It's just like this. By the way, just for filling everything in, here's the finished z-axis if I just draw it dotted through the cube, and here's the finished y-axis if I dot it through the cube. Now I can just get rid of all that drawing and we can actually do something. Now I say I want to move this cube right here, this direction. Just a tip, each of these boxes in Blender is 1 meter. So you can calculate how far you want to move your object. So let's count the amount of boxes. 1, 2, 3, 4. That means I have to move my box 4 meters along the y-axis. Now using this gizmo up here, you can check if it's negative or positive. Because if you could only go that way, that would not be good if you had to reverse your car for some reason. Maybe you took the wrong route. But we don't really have 6 axes in Blender. So the backwards axis is negative. So if you want to move an object on an axis, you can press G and then the axis on your keyboard. So now it's stuck to that axis and you'll see the axis being highlighted. That means we are snapped to that axis, and no matter how much we try to move it off that axis, the cube just won't go there. Now if you type any number on your keyboard like 4, it will move it that many meters positive on that axis. We recall that this is positive for y and this is negative. So if I want to go and make it go backwards, you have to type negative 4 meters. But now we have a problem. The object should have ended up here, but it's here. Well, that's because we counted from the edge of the object. Now Blender actually moves the object through an imaginary point called the origin, which you'll see highlighted orange every time you select an object. And by default, cubes, spheres and everything in Blender is 2 by 2 meters, which is quite large considering I'm about 1.5 meters tall. So me standing right here would be something like this. So that's quite big cube. So since the origin is in the center of the object, we can subtract 1 meter for the side that we had measured it from. So we actually have to move it in extra 1 meter negative. We can apply the same concept to scaling, but you're like, so it scales it to exactly like 5 meters. Well, wrong. If I type in 1, it actually scales it to 2 meters because it multiplies the size of your object by whatever number is here. So if you type 2, it will turn 2 into 4. So now our cube is 4 by 4 by 4 meters. And that's the size I mentioned. And if you hold control, it just snaps. So even moving, scaling, and even rotating. Yes, you can also rotate and scale on axes. I'll show you how that works in a second. For rotating, you just do the axis just like this. And for scaling, just type in the axis. For scaling, a really useful trick is holding shift and clicking in axes. I'll click shift Z. So that scales it on both axes except for Z. This is useful for making something like a brick because bricks aren't generally that tall, but they're pretty long and sometimes wide. So that's useful. Now that we've learned in a rather long lesson how to move, scale, rotate objects in Blender precisely, in the next video we're going to be uncovering a secret that's been lying in the top left corner of your screen the whole time.